Hello, and welcome back to another midnight sewing edition of What's on the Work Table and what are we going to do today? Kidding. Today is a bunny blanket, a costume, and a costume that's going to be for a puppy. So technically it's more like a day in the zoo at this sewing table. I thought I would introduce the topic by first showing off a bunch of samples that I got at a charity sale here in town. And as a bonus, if you guys stay to the end of this video, you can see how the bunny received his blanket and the reaction from him. So we might as well get on to talking about the clothes and the thrifting, so here we go. Some of what I gathered here for thrifting purposes are actually meant to be consigned to another store later on. Some just required mending. These were found in a bucket that were marked down to $2 each, so I decided to take advantage of this and mend them and then send them off to the consignment store. This particular set of tiny pants was meant as a gift, but the rest of it was meant to be flipped and mended. So this here was just a tiny thread poking out of the weave of the fabric. Some designers like to tuck those things back in. I decided to just go ahead and cut it where it sat. And because we love clothes so much, these items were all purchased inexpensively at something called Bianca Amours, which in Canada is our liquidation store that seems to be really quite popular. These running shoes, which I'm currently into, are Nikes, and I recently thrifted them. And to do so, you wash them in a sanitizing wash, and as long as they don't have a lot of wear, they're good to go. So, again, who wants to see a tutorial now about how to sew things instead of the thread? Okay, here we go, doggy suit. So, here we have my initial sketches. I was commissioned to sew the Ninja Turtles manager's dog costume, which previous to this doesn't exist as an actual pattern, so I had to strictly make a lot of measurements and a lot of drawings. Basically the same measurements that we take for humans, height, length of arms, width across the do you think I could say it? Width across the shoulders, width across the tummy, and just how wide his collar was. So I transferred these things out onto paper, same as I would for a human. I used the basic idea of a shirt to mark out his measurements onto paper, and then I used objects around the house to mark out sleeves and circumferences just to get an approximation of height and depth of each item. There are costumes that you can get for kids based on gi patterns, and because the Rat King happens to have an actual sensei gi, I thought why not go to the pros and look at what they're wearing. When I'm in a martial arts class, I do have a proper gi, and when I'm training I have different gis of different kinds, and I thought, you know what, I have this magazine on hand, I'm gonna double check some seamings that I have both known, used, worn, and seen on other people. So for here I'm using references as far as height of collar. It's the same as it would be on a female. Most gis are 100% gender neutral. There are very slight differences, if any differences, in a gi. And here, because I didn't have the dog, this is my model, and what luck, he happens to be the exact same size as my actual client. The only thing is that I do think from collarbone to tail, he is actually longer. But he's pretty much identical. The client I was sewing for, he was a mixed breed, so he has different sort of genetics creating different shoulder widths than any one specific breed. I decided to go to the thrift store and find a basic t-shirt to sew it together from, and I found the closest thing I could to the actual proper color. And then I just continued transferring my markings and making notations. I do tend to use Crayola markers because they're washable. when I finally had all of the markings drawn out, I decided to make a final copy and just go ahead and cut it out. Here for the shoulder, it was a little bit higher, so I added some paper, taped it down, and cut that out. So now we have double checked everything. I've also double checked with photos of my client for height and size and weight, and drawn out his little sleeve. The area that by far gave me the most difficulty was having a rounded front edge on the actual gi itself, which is fine on a human, but on a dog I actually had to account for the shape of his chest being broader and more deep as far as little doggies and their rib cages. So this got a little bit more complex, and back I went to my math and my drawing and my calculations of height and depth and width of all the fabric that I intended to be using and all the paper that I had, and whether or not I could actually make it work. And then going from when I had made gis myself, trying to translate that into height and depth for dogs. And then I decided to just go ahead and make lunch, because this was a point to where if I didn't eat now, I'd just end up not eating at all during the project. And now having basic final draft, I decided it was safe enough to go ahead and actually finish cutting it out. I did have to extend the front gi panel again, so adding taping, finally cutting these things out using my handmade paperweights covered in old tissue paper and inspirational writings from my family. I got my rotary cutter out and decided that it was finally safe enough to go ahead and start cutting the pieces out. So for basic seams, I just did a one-sided rollover hem. It's not crazy neat or tidy. These would be cleaned up as I went along. Basic pinnings, you don't have to pin the whole thing, and then make sure not to be interrupted by the local windstorm that happens to be blowing everything around, ever, always, ever, all over your street, brought on with a storm. Realized, looking at the photos, that it was time that I had better start coming up with a plan to make the logo that he had on the front of his shirt. So I started cutting this out and making a thing using buttons, and then I realized how terrible this looked and decided to come up with a better plan. Meanwhile, I decided to move on and do the gi belt, which, using traditional folds, is based on fabric being rolled over many times and then stitched in place many times. So here is a really simple little gi belt made to fit the width of his little tummy, and just, in fact, to look fairly official. And if I'm honest, this is by far my most favorite part of making his little costume. The only downside is that because my client happens to have an owner who works in the public eye, I cannot share with you a photo of the finished product. And because I worked with his owner a few years ago on different projects, she thought of me, and I was more than happy to work on the project. For fixing the decoration to the front of the gi, I just used E6000 to get it to stay. The first time I did use buttons and ended up sticking with that design, but I had to cut out the orange piece twice. And because it's Halloween, can you ever have enough candy? Oh good, back to the costume. Okay, and here you go, McCall's 6184. In case you were wondering, here's the long-awaited bunny blanket project reveal. He was so happy with his little blanket that he immediately went and burrowed underneath it and made a little hut inside his little basket inside his cage. I'd like to give a big shout out to the new followers, subscribers, likers, and sharers of Sewn for Sports YouTube channel. Your support and help is greatly appreciated, and I love hearing from you. Please consider leaving a comment after the video. Stay tuned for another episode of sewing coming soon.